Hey there, folks. Welcome to Spectrum Pulse. We talk about music, movies, art, and culture, and we're doing another solo review, this time of the newest album from Shawn Mendes, Wonder. So, full honesty here, I was not intending this to be a solo review. Hell, I was not preparing for any albums before the end of this year to merit solo reviews. You think I have time for this right now? But no, sometimes you hear a project and you realize, oh, there's gonna be no way I can talk about this in a snippet just on the Pulse. I need some time to dissect this in detail. And yet, why in the nine hells would I expect that coming out of Shawn Mendes? Even as someone who has some pretty significant ups and downs with this guy, he was never this sort of artist for me. He made relatively cute, mainstream accessible acoustic pop, maybe flirting with R&B and pop rock a little bit. Even at his worst on Illuminate, before they shoved in There's Nothing Holding Me Back to gaslight people into thinking that album was tolerable, it was bad, but in a predictable way. We've heard the sort of derivative, basic singer-songwriter shtick before. And you know what? It was kind of similar at his best. He was rarely great, but the stuff that worked had a good hook or a nice rollicking groove, or paid a lot of homage to his influences pretty well. I would describe the majority of his recorded output as more blandly competent. Yeah, I've already had niggling issues across the board, especially in production, but it wasn't because he was taking a lot of weird experimental chances that just didn't agree with me. Hell, I didn't even think he was that kind of act at all. And for the record, that's absolutely fine. There's nothing wrong with being conventional pop. That's where a lot of great craftsmanship can really shine. And I'll be honest, I thought that was where Shawn Mendes was going to go with his career, sort of like in the same vein as Niall Horan. But something struck me as a miss really right from the start of this album cycle. For one, it felt like Wonder was dropping from out of nowhere with limited buzz and promotion. The singles were getting pushed in a way that implies they weren't going to slow down or delay this release if the singles underperformed, which labels would have the right to do in late 2020. And for the records, the singles, they mostly have underperformed. And the timing's weird too. Yeah, his girlfriend Camila Cabello saw success pushing Romance last year around a similar time, and that project was a total mess, but it was clearly pop, and it was set up to do well even if I thought it sucked. Now, the title track of this album, though, it felt like he was trying to make Harry Styles' Sign of the Times, and it was not working, which makes kind of sense, because his longtime co-writer Teddy Geiger was gone, and replaced with Kid Harpoon, who is most well known recently for working on the last two Harry Styles albums. Now, to me, that wasn't an immediate warning sign. I'm not a fan of Teddy Geiger's writing as it is. Her departure didn't strike me as ruinous, but when Monster really soured on me, I got the impression that this could go wrong in ways that I was not predicting. So you know what? I went in with no expectations with Wonder. What the hell happened? Well, you know what, actually, let's not dance around this. There is a reason why this is getting a solo review, and it's not because this is what anyone would expect coming from Shawn Mendes. In fact, I'd say that Wonder is a sort of daring but kind of baffling album where for the first time in his career, Shawn Mendes tried to make a unique artistic swing for the fences, a swerve away from his safe niches in acoustic pop, or even his tasteful rollicking bounce around it. What it reminded me way more of was something out of the singer-songwriter material from the late 70s, where they were trying to pick up just enough groove for the now overwhelming presence of disco to the schmaltzy and increasingly overblown sounds of arena-focused soft rock. You release this album in 1978 or 79, there is a likelihood it makes sense. Hell, it could even make sense now, given that Kid Harpoon is behind the scenes, and the fact that Shawn Mendes just got off an insane arena tour, and he's looking to do it all again with songs that are built for that. And yet it doesn't work at all. And I don't hate this album for making that swing. In a perverse way, I almost kind of respect the effort and the fact that this is the biggest chance that Shawn Mendes has ever taken in his career, but it flies in the face of his strengths and content in such a jarring way that I've got no choice but to consider this a failure. An utterly fascinating one, but again, a failure nonetheless. And really, this conversation has to start with Shawn Mendes and his limitations as a performer. I'm gonna say he's not a strong singer, and that has a lot less to do with his talent and more to do with his presence and presentation in the mix. Because if anything, this album shows that he's working his ass off, and he's clearly trying to show off more vocal range, and I think his falsetto is actually better than I expected. Why he didn't just go pure new disco and rip off the Bee Gees or continue to rip off Justin Timberlake, it's kind of baffling to me. But what he doesn't project is strength or presence in the mix here. He'll try to belt, but it doesn't contain any sense of fire or edge or swell or greater charisma to ride these arrangements, especially when you consider just how many sidelong glances this album is making at Harry Styles. We'll get to Kid Harpoon's contributions to the production in a minute, but if there is an artist that Shawn Mendes is desperately trying to emulate beyond the occasional Ed Sheeran knockoff from 2014, it is Harry Styles, but that's the thing. Harry Styles can sell confidence, and it has a ton of natural charisma, even if he's leaning into the lightweight Fleetwood Mac riffs. He will command a mix. Shawn Mendes can get swallowed in it, but arguably it might be worse than that. Whenever Shawn Mendes really tries to sell these songs, he just comes across as incredibly insecure in them. Not just in the lyrics, which we will get to, but how whenever we get to an abortive crescendo, it never properly crests, or how when he's supposed to hit those really intensive belting moments, his voice is actually pulled back a little bit in the mix, which to me implies he either didn't hit the notes all that well, or he wasn't mic'd in a way to sell it properly and they had to clean it up in post, because I've unfortunately seen a lot of that too. But you know what? None of this is surprising, because Shawn Mendes' template was not built for the scale that he's reached as a pop star. Yeah, he's had his oversold melodramatic pop songs that might play kind of well to the arena audience, but that's more driven on heavier percussion than the arrangements or the compositions. Hell, look at how gutless the guitar breakdown is on There's Nothing Holding Me Back, when it could have soared or really delivered with a real solo. But again, that's kind of territory he can control, and when he can relax into it, it's led to his best songs. But on the other hand, his worst music has come when he's tried to sell drama that he can't back up. And really, this album is that on steroids. But this is where we get into composition, and where I apparently owe Teddy Geiger a massive apology. One thing this album makes abundantly clear is that her contributions to structure and underlying groove behind Shawn Mendes' past two albums at least gave them hooks and presence in a way this album just does not have to the same extent. Made all the worse by how anthemic this project is trying to be. That's another reason I pointed to late 70s arena rock, because that's a clear influence for Kid Harpoon's production. Because the bloat and pomposity of that era, by the end, that hadn't been smashed to pieces by punk or mutated by disco, it eventually fell out of favor because it just collapsed under its own weight. It just ultimately felt so hollow. And I hear a similar hollowness in this album. This is where a great performance at the core can save an album and provide that foundation, but since I've described how Shawn Mendes cannot project that strength, he winds up trying to hold together arrangements that are just too big and bombastic for him, but since none of them have much in the way of complementary groove, they wind up feeling simultaneously a bit underweight. Now, the title track is the most obvious early example of this, but it continues across the album in Call My Friends with that ugly, flat grind trying to ramp up into a hook that does not coalesce. Why does that kick drum have no punch to it? Or the clunky attempts at Vaporwave with the synths on Dream that actually had some potential before the guitars and drums came in and killed the atmosphere? Or how Always Been You will try to drop out the instrumental for dramatic contrast and it just feels painfully thin, especially those horns. Or how the most dominant instrument on Song for No One, after the beat switch, it's sleigh bells. I mean, the one time he gets close to making all that bombast work is Look Up at the Stars, with the obvious 70s singer-songwriter slash Elton John influence, but at least the guitar solo there has some meat to it I can respect. Now, to be fair, as I implied, he does try to embrace a little bit of groovy, offbeat, quasi-disco production, like with the obvious Ed Sheeran plagiarism on Higher with some truly ugly guitar warbling, or how Teach Me How to Love brings in Anderson .Paak of all people on the drums, and the bass line is still shockingly stodgy, and yet even as Shawn Mendes gets eclipsed by his own backing singer, these songs at least sound the most fun here, or at least the most ready for mainstream radio. I'll give him that. But you know, we gotta get to the elephant in the room, the presence that overshadows the standard version of this album to a frankly alarming extent, in the same way that his presence shaded and colored her album last year. Camila Cabello. Now, the vast majority of this album, if not directly targeted at her, has damn near her in subtext on pretty much every song to an almost overpowering degree. And while I find that kind of amusing because, in my opinion, he's a much better singer and writer than her, but you can also tell just how paralyzed he is by this relationship. She holds all the cards, and on a fundamental level, he's kind of terrified of all of it, to the point where in discussing this album with people, I had folks ask me whether or not he was actually still in the relationship. That's how much anxiety comes through on this album. And I can't tell you how much that feeling will just fly in complete contrast with the big love-struck moments he's trying to sell here. He conveys anxiety so effectively, which we know is true because on songs like Mercy and In My Blood, he's proven he can sell it, but it colors the sincere relationship moments here and leave them feeling way more desperate than they should. Hell, he calls the track Song for No One, and we all know who the hell it's actually about, even before the overblown bombast made it obvious, but in the third verse, he sneaks in how much she didn't reciprocate his feelings 3 years ago when he first wrote the song, and yet that insecurity is still lingering across this album. Or you know what, take 305, which I've seen folks describe as a Strokes-like, and that might be the biggest insult against that man since Julian Casablancas' falsetto sounds like barbecuing a live cat. It's really just a limp garage throwback, let's be real here. But you know what, the entire song is about how much of a paranoid wreck he is in this relationship, especially that he can't sell this with the old school showmanship implied by this instrumental style. Even the closing track, which is so spare and acoustic and intimate and centers his fears of losing her and being alone, that's above everything. Hell, probably the most slick groove on the album is Piece of You, and that's because it actually leans into the spiky, ugly jealousy in the composition and content, even up the Prince to Justin Timberlake to Ed Sheeran to Shawn Mendes influence. It's the most flagrant it's ever been, but it's probably the best song here. Now, you know what? In theory, none of this has to be a bad thing. Angst and insecurity in a relationship can be a great source of internal drama, even inflated to arena size. Hell, go back to the era, look at Rumors by Fleetwood Mac. And I think with the right control of atmosphere, Shawn Mendes might be able to sell it, especially given how much of it is rooted in a desire to present more traditionally masculine gender roles in this relationship, especially as a song like 24 Hours implies he's trying to put aside his own overthinking and look towards a marriage at his age. And this isn't projection. He's talked about this at length for years in interviews, and while I'd argue kind of again it reflects more insecurity when it overpowers the more love-struck moments on the album or just colors them to agree that you can't ignore it, I do think as gender roles evolve, it's a conversation worth having. The problem is that for as besotted and insecure as this album is, there just isn't that same degree of introspection. Not just because Shawn Mendes is a pretty basic songwriter and doesn't include much in the way of distinctive detail, but there's no change or personal revelation or sense of growth or even something that would contribute to the larger conversation about masculinity, where the insecurity he describes likely resonates with a lot more guys, especially of his age, than they would want to admit. And yet, in no part of that conversation, we need to involve Justin Bieber. I've already talked about Monster on Billboard Breakdown, but the fact that this song is on the album and pushed as a single tells me so much about how this album was made and promoted. Because without Teddy Geiger's co-writes, there's not really a radio hook that's built for the album. And Shawn Mendes is a pop radio act. Even with those new disco tunes, they're not rising to his best. My bet is that he made the album, he got it sent to Island, which is a Universal subsidiary. They panicked because there's not an obvious radio single besides Wonder getting the same marketing plan as Sign of the Times, and they convinced Shawn Mendes to team up with Bieber as a late addition. Ergo, I get why the song is here. But it's also the worst song on the album by a country mile, and while Shawn Mendes is on theme and can kind of work with this atmosphere and production better than actually some other songs here, Justin Bieber completely kills the project's intimacy and doesn't fit at all. Honestly, if I'm rewriting the album, I would take Justin Bieber off this song. I would put on Camila Cabello. Explore her angst in contrast to Shawn Mendes. Gives her more defined presence on the album. Move her from subtext to an actual performer. The complications in her own backstory with Fifth Harmony would provide an interesting juxtaposition to his. Maybe add roots to the drama. Hell, it would even have her stick in a register that might flatter her voice. It would certainly be better than tacking her onto a deluxe reissue that's being pushed in record time, which tells me that the early internal numbers turned out rough. That is all I'm saying. interesting. But to summarize all this album both fascinates and frustrates me, if you can't tell. I don't think it's his worst by any margin. The original version of Illuminate actively angers me to this day, whereas this is just perplexing in its ambition and misfire. It's hopelessly derivative in a lot of spots, but Shawn Mendes does have more unique presence and voice on this album than he ever has before. It's just a shame that said voice doesn't actively contribute to the album's strengths. It's a project where I'm honestly torn whether or not I want it to be more or less commercial or traditionally pop, because it's all the non-commercial moves that make it a failure, but also make it interesting. Now, the dramatically unfair comparison that came to my mind immediately was Paula, the disastrous album from Robin Thicke in 2014 that has way more parallels to this than fans might want to admit. The production direction is scattered at best, and it really is at its best leaning into the darker grooves. The love story is painted with raging personal issues that overshadow any relationship. The attempts at bombast are flailing and very questionably produced. The label probably viewed this as a nightmare to ship and market, and given the Spotify numbers I've seen in the Q4 release window and late Q4 at best, this is gonna underperform. And you know what? Dig even a little bit more deeply into the lyrics, and it's a weirdly uncomfortable listen. And yet, unlike Paula, I paradoxically don't want to see this fail. This is Shawn Mendes actually taking an enormously awkward step towards artistic growth, and even if he's face planting, I don't want him to stop trying. So while I'm going to give this a 4 out of 10, I do think people should hear it. It's fascinating. It might be one of those failures that will stick with you longer than the albums you even like. I mean, it's not good by any means, but it is interesting. And around 2020, on that merit, actually worth hearing. Give it a listen if you're curious, because it is something. So yeah, thanks a lot for watching. If you'd like to like and subscribe, I'd be more than grateful. I'm a little bit surprised I had this much material to talk about a new Shawn Mendes album, but again, this album is fascinating to dig into, just because how it fails is interesting. I at least think on that level. I don't know how the fans are really responding to it. Let me know in the comments below how wrong I am. I'm looking forward to that. But hey, like, if this is your thing, I am genuinely curious how this is going down for you, because again, it's a weird listen. Beyond that, though, anything else I might be able to do to improve my presentation, I'm all ears. And if you guys want to get albums on my schedule before the end of the year, link to my Patreon is right over there. Again, feel no obligation. It's tough times for everyone right now, and if you don't have it at this time, I get it. I'll be all right. But if you want to, there's the option. But until then, I'm Mark. You're watching Spectrum Pulse, and I'll see you next time.